Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another video. Battle for Azeroth, yes, it's still here. With all the hype about Shadowlands being thrown about over the last couple of weeks, I'd kind of forgotten all about it until last night when I watched Preacher's videos about the mythic bosses in the new raid. And I was like, oh yeah, there's an entire new raid and patch to go until we travel to the Shadowlands. However, I think it's time to take a look back at Battle for Azeroth and see if Blizzard did do as bad as some people think they did. The story. Now, I've played through both the Horde and the Alliance stories up to this point. Be aware, there are still more stories to come in 8.3, but I think it's personally been pretty good. The leveling zones were interesting. However, the choose your own way in the storyline, where you could choose which zones to do in what order, made it quite hard to have a linear timeline, for example. The Horde leveling zones of Nazmir and Zuldazar, where we met the lower Bwonsamdi, if you played through Zuldazar first, when Rastakhan is betrayed by Zul and Razan is needed to retrieve the soul of Rastakhan from Bwonsamdi, the lower doesn't seem to know us, which makes a lot of sense. But when we travel to Nazmir, you could expect him to recognise us when we visit his temple. However, there is no mention of our previous meeting, and it's vice versa if you did it the other way around. It may seem like such a little thing, but to people who follow the story very closely, which I normally do on my first time playthrough, it can sometimes break the immersion within the story itself. The Alliance didn't seem to have the same problem to a point, and it only really started to become a problem nearer the end of the Kultira story. We can now see that the Horde starting zones related more to the Uldir raid and corruption throughout the Zandalari Empire, and the Alliance starting zones related more with the Ashara 8.2, with 8.1 linking the two from the Horde to the Alliance in the Battle of Dazar'alor, and we'll come on to that raid in a little while. 8.2 was where the story fell a little bit short for me personally. I feel like the war campaign and the Ashara story got a little bit too mixed up, and they weren't defined because we were coming to and from each story. Mechagon was an exception to this. However, I personally think it was a secondary storyline, out of the way of everything else. If you think about it actually, we've done a lot in 8.2, but it doesn't feel like that until you stop and actually think about it. We've stopped Ashara, we've released N'Zoth, freed Bane and got Saurfang killed whilst finishing off the war campaign. We've stopped King Mechagon and his plans to create a mechanical kingdom, and we've also chased Rathian around the world all in one patch. This patch feels more quantity rather than quality, so hopefully they pull back on the story and make it a little bit more detailed rather than more of it, if that makes sense. Which I think they'll do, because like Warlords of Draenor, they want to forget the whole expansion and move on to something else. Well, I would anyway. The dungeons and the raids. I've loved the dungeons this expansion, apart from one. I hate Freehold. I think it's one of the worst dungeons that's ever been created. Chasing a pig around a pen? But that's in my opinion, and that might be because I'm not very good at it. On the other end of the scale, Waycrest Manor. It's my favourite, and is why I'm looking forward to Ravendreth. It feels like a dungeon. There was a good balance of trash to bosses. It was good, one of the dungeons that changed slightly each time you played it, with different doors opening, making you kill different bosses in a different order. The mega dungeon of Mechagon was pretty good. The hard mode gave it another level to just being normal, but you were one of these two types of people. You either killed everything and completed everything in the first couple of tries, or you were in that dungeon for at least 3 hours each time. Unfortunately, I'm in that group. It would be nice for them to expand on the story a little, but it was awesome to learn more about the gnomes in general, since we don't actually know a lot about them compared to the other races. Now, the raids this expansion have been interesting. Uldir was just funny for me. The very first time I went into Uldir, I pulled the first boss by using a lock portal, which threw me across the room and straight into Talok. And that's where the fun began. I never cleared Mythic Uldir at current content time, and only went back there on Mythic at the end of the Battle of Dazar'alor, which we'll talk about in a second. Mother was my favourite fight, and Zor was my least. My guild wiped more times on Zor than Gahoon. Now, the Battle of Azurite. Wow. A little backstory. My all-time favourite raid is the Nighthold, followed closely by the Tomb of Sargeras. But the Battle of Azurite has, in my opinion, and seeing so far the bosses in Ny'alotha, will be my favourite raid this expansion. The idea of the Alliance actually raiding, or the Horde pushing the Alliance out, was an amazing idea. Beating the crap out of Mechatork should have been my favourite fight in this raid, but it was actually Opulus. Having to split into 2 different teams and battle through the defences while gold and poison was being thrown at you was fun, and a high chance of a BOE dropping at the end of the boss was great. Plus, it was my highest passed boss of the raid, but that probably doesn't mean anything. The Eternal Palace as a raid was pretty good. I personally think the world first race for this raid was the best there's ever been. I think some of the bosses were broken at the start of the mythic stuff, but it was great to watch since I've never actually got to fight Mythic Ashara since I'm still stuck on Zakul, but I'll get there one day. They tried a little bit too hard with the underwater fight to try and make it different, and in my opinion it didn't work, but apart from that it was pretty good. Warfronts. Now, there's not a lot to say about Warfronts because, well, there's not a lot to Warfronts. The first time I played through the Battle of Stromgarde, it was awesome. Charging through a battlefield and killing hundreds of Alliance troops was fun, and that was the only time it was fun. It was never very different apart from the commanders directing the forces. It's a shame since they had a lot of potential, and when it came to the Darkshore Warfront being released, no one was excited for it. It would be nice if they did something like Warfronts in the future, but just make it better and more interesting. However, if I was Blizz, I'd leave it for a while before trying it again, because the only good thing about Warfronts, in my opinion, was it was good for catching up in gear store, apart from it not giving you rings or trinkets, which, by the way, I think is bollocks. Now, I've been putting this one off because it's the worst thing about the expansion, and that's the A word. Azurite has been the downfall for this expansion. It was meant to be an improvement on the artifact weapon in Legion, but in my opinion, it made it worse. Having to grind the levels on your Heart of Azeroth through islands, which I haven't made a separate section about because it was just the same. You had different enemies, but it was so boring. Yes, you had the chance of getting a mount, but I run so many and only ever got one. High-end players were grinding for higher levels to unlock the same traits, just slightly better, on items that they'd already spent time earning. And unless you had lots of Titan Residium to buy a specific piece, you could waste all of it on a random piece, at least with the artifact weapon, until the end of Legion, when it got just totally stupid. You were working towards something, where with the Azurite piece, you'd unlock the last trait on a 390 piece, for example, and then have to start again once you got a 400 piece. For me, it didn't make me want to play, and that's the reason why I took so many breaks from Battle for Azeroth. Blizzard, yes, did win some of my respect back through the essences in 8.2 by giving us something to work towards for all types of WoW players, whether that was dungeoning, PvP, or raiding. And we've worked towards our rank 3 essence for power, and for the people who wanted to look cool, they could work towards their rank 4. Obviously, some essences are better than others, but with the success of essences, it looks like Blizzard are using them as a stepping stone to the new abilities of Covenants coming in Shadowlands, which I think is personally good. Now, I haven't been a high raider like I was in Legion because of the Azurite system, but from what I've heard from other content creators who do play at a high level, it's the worst thing about Battle for Azeroth for them. So, overall, what do I think about Battle for Azeroth? Well, as you can tell, I'm half and half. Half of the things I love, and half of the things I hate. Now, I look forward to Shadowlands, but I also look forward to BFA, so please, Blizzard, for the love of God, don't fuck it up. What did you guys think of Battle for Azeroth? Let me know what you think they could have done sooner to make it better in the comments below. And the last thing I'd like to say to Blizzard, if anyone is listening, and please, someone make a forum about this, please get rid of the mission table in Shadowlands. It's useless.